Uh, Thanks everyone for coming, and anyone who might watch this later. I don't know if this, I guess this is a live stream now, and we'll be recording this. Super excited to be here. Super thankful to all the organizers for making this happen, and really excited to be talking about this subject today. So let's get started. I created this talk, and the original idea of the talk was about how we can, make changes in an organization when we embrace open source. But actually decided like that's the wrong title for this talk. It's just wasn't really a fitting title. So I said, we're going to start over, and I want to, rework this talk. So you actually know the new title of this talk. This is the one that I actually put on the schedule. Decided I'm going to change it to the Zen and the Art of Organizational Open Source. So really, how can we apply open source in organizations and drive value in organizations? Honestly, is what I want to do and what I strive to do during this presentation. So, why did I rename it? Because at the end of the day, I thought this presentation would be a lot better if I put in a lot of really cute animal pictures. So any kind of Zen animal picture, I thought that would be really important to drive home the point of this organization. And talking about these subjects, it's always a little bit more fun when we have cute animals. So let's get a little bit more serious. My name is Cody Zuschlag. I'm a staff developer relations engineer at Nearform. I also teach at the local university where I live in France. So heads up, it is midnight where I'm located doing this talk remotely. So I'm a little tired. You can probably see my eyes. I'm going to do my best to bring some energy here, and just really thankful to be here and to be talking to everyone. You can scan that QR code now. I'll put that QR code up at the end too. If you want to know more about these subjects, if you want to, access the slides for this talk, if you want to know more about me, more about my employer Nearform, feel free to scan that QR code. And if you didn't have time to scan it now, I'll put it up again at the end of the talk. Also, I have to give a little shout out to somebody important that helped make this talk become a reality. That's Paula Paul. She does all kinds of amazing things, not to mention that she is more or less my boss. Well, more or less, she is my boss. And she's also a board member at the OpenJS Foundation. So you may know her. You may have heard her, may have seen her around at the conference. She does lots of other amazing things around the Grace Hopper, which is just this really inclusive community for bringing people into tech. Plenty of other things. Go check out Paula Paul if you want to know more about her and some of the amazing things that she's doing. And like I said, this talk wouldn't be possible without her. So why should organizations care about open source, right? That's why we're here. That's what we came for. That's the question that we're going to try to answer today. And I was considering this question at work and, coming up with this talk. And what we did is we went out and we hired a team of researchers and data scientists, and they developed, the most advanced models and simulations, and they did a meta study with super atomic computers to come to this conclusion, which is the more effort that your organization puts into open source, and the more they direct that effort towards having an impact on the community, the more value it's going to bring to the organization. And we can see that here in that red zone. We modeled this study that we did. So that's just a really ridiculous joke that I'm making. I just stole this graphic off of Google Images and renamed the axes. There was no study, nothing like that. But the point that this graphic really points out is that I'm going to convince you today that we can bring value back to an organization by investing in open source. And we want to be up there in that red zone, or that pink arrow is like, that's our goal. And this graphic also is cool because, it shows that it's exponential too, right? At the beginning, you're going to, put in a lot of effort, and you're going to focus that on the community. and you might not get as much value back. But once you get moving, like it's a slow process to get moving. But once you move, it's going to grow exponentially. And the further you move up in your open source experience, the more value it'll bring back to your organization. So, what does it mean to be Zen? And if we can maximize that open source effort and the impact and the value, what can we do? We can be Zen. Like that's where our goal is here, right? And we're talking about curating communities and contributing to open source projects. So what does it mean to be Zen when I'm talking about open source, when we apply that to an organization? So to reach like full open source Zen, we could do all kinds of interesting things to our organization, like attracting and retaining talent. I'm thinking about my job experiences, right? Like when I'm going and searching for a new job, I want to work someplace where I get to work on open source tools and contribute to open source projects. And if not only that, but when you have, talent at your organization, it's going to help retain them if they can work on those types of projects. I speak from, personal experience. The jobs where I stayed the longest were when, I was able to work on open source projects. Something more tangible that we can, count with numbers is, the maintenance cost that comes along with commercial, non-open source commercial software. And this is something that isn't always clear to us, the consumers of that software, but usually non-open source commercial software carries like an 18 to 20% annual maintenance fee. And this goes towards like features and a roadmap that's opaque that you have no control over, right? Like you don't know what features are going to come out in next year's, Office suite, or, name your commercial software license that your organization use. Like you don't have control or impact over that roadmap. So imagine if we could take that 18, 20% and we could invest that in working on, an open source project that serves the same goals and functionality. And all of a sudden we can have, impact on the roadmap and the features because we're investing in that open source project. So we can take that money, that 18 to 20%, and we can invest that to get more features out of those projects. So this is something really cool and something important that sometimes is overlooked when we're talking about open source. And if we have like a healthy open source community and, a successful open source project, we need to have a great developer experience, right? We need to have documentation, READMEs, a CI pipeline with automations. If you're putting your code in GitHub, you have tags, great for beginners, and people are willing to help people get started and work on a project. Like the developer experience is essential to have a healthy open source project. So if you're willing to invest in that, it means you're going to have a great developer experience for internal folks, for new hires, people coming on. They'll be able to work on that project. I'm thinking how many times I've worked at a company and a new developer comes onto the team and they ask me, where are the docs? And they're like, oh, yeah, the documentation. Well, that just got deprioritized. We had that ship it mentality. So the docs, like they don't really exist or they're really out of date. So why don't you just shadow me for a couple of weeks? And, your first task will be to go and write that documentation. This is something I've actually said to people coming and working on my team. So I want to, challenge us to get away from that. Like, let's make a quality public project, and then, we'll benefit from that internally to our organization also. Now, we have to do something also for the marketing folks at our organization, right? So by investing in open source and maybe working on a project that's well known, it's creating brand recognition. So obviously I'll name the big players, right? If I'm thinking of, React or React Native, right? Who am I thinking of? Obviously Facebook, Meta, however you want to say that. Or if I'm thinking of Material UI or, plenty of other open source projects, like we think of a certain brand, right? So by getting involved or sponsoring like a successful open source project, we can build brand recognition for our organization also. Now, this presentation wouldn't be complete if I didn't also think about the executive folks too, right? So by working on open source, we can, reinforce our corporate goals and values to keep all the executives happy, that are bringing their corporate values diagram and creating the corporate goals for that organization. They can do that. We can reinforce those values in a concrete way. So they're not just talking the talk, but they're also walking the walk, especially around things around sustainability and community. Here's like a real opportunity for them, for us, the organization, to reinforce those goals and values. So I also like to think of this as like a metaphor too, right? Because the metaphor that I want to present to you is the difference between, renting an apartment versus like buying a home, right? And if you buy a house or buy a home, you're going to be, living and investing in that community with your neighbors and trying to, better that community. Whereas if you're just renting an apartment somewhere, maybe it's temporary, maybe you don't feel quite as, you don't have your roots as deep in that environment. So I think that's a great metaphor when we're thinking about, using commercial software versus, investing in open source software. Now, I talked about the maintenance fees, and I mentioned Microsoft, Office, or whatever. And we can't control what's coming in the next version, not even around patches or fixes. Like, we don't have control over that. If we talk about an open source software, like, we can actually do those things, and we can rely on the community to hopefully surface bugs and bug fixes much faster when we're talking about an open source project. So, how do we reach that open source Zen? Like, that's what I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation. In order to do that, though, we need to create some sort of scale, like some sort of measurement system. So we need to define, what are the open source maturity levels? Like, what are the levels that we could achieve to reach open source Zen? Because we can't just go from 0 to full on Zen, right? There's plenty of steps in between. And then I'm going to challenge you at the end of this organization to go back and think about, where does your organization sit? Like, what's the current level of your organization? What's its current Zen level? And how could you work towards, reaching the next Zen level? Like, that's what we want to do. We want to level up, right? So what are the reasons to level up? That's what I'm going to try to present for the rest of this presentation. So real quick, let's talk about the levels. The first level is going to be denial. All closed source, commercially licensed software. I'm going to deep dive into these levels in just a second. So I'm going to go over them a little bit quickly right now. The next level is going to be fear. Step 2, level 2. And here, maybe you're going to have lockdown dependencies. So like, you're using some open source software, but you're really hesitant about it. Level 3 is what we're going to call bargaining. Here you might have more of an open dependency tree, open dependency system, but you're not, creating an environment where you can contribute to open source. Next Zen level, level 4, acceptance. So here you're empowering your devs and to use open source in the way that best, solves the solutions that you're trying to create. And you're also contributing back to an ecosystem. And the final full Zen level, level 5, enlightenment, where you're using open source in a strategic way to differentiate your organization from the competition, right? So it's just differentiating investment in open source. So that's the full Zen level. So let's dive in a little bit deeper on each of those levels. Level 1, denial. This is where we're talking about no open source. Like, there's a policy, no open source. And you're using all closed source, commercially licensed software, right? And someone, decided, like, they really see this open source as something dangerous. They're scared about it. There's fears about security and the supply chain. And I love this idea of no open source. I've worked at a company like this, but at the end of the day, you have to ask, like, do you have a website? Do you build any internal software? Do you build anything for that website? Do you have any mobile applications? Like, they're using open source software, even though they don't know it, right? So they may have this no open source policy, but it's really just something made of fiction, because, any modern tools are built upon the open source foundations that they get us to where we need to be today. And like I said, I've worked for employers like this who just rejected all ideas of open source. They wanted to own all the source code, and they really saw the source code as a core value of their product. And I feel like that's just a fallacy, right? Like if your most important part of your product is the source code, like you're limiting the potential, right? Like you can't have a real big impact on your users if you think like the source code is the most important thing. I truly believe this. So next level uh, is going to be level 2, the fear. And here we could, you're going to have a really tightly controlled supply chain, and the devs are going to struggle to be productive in this kind of environment. So I'm thinking about having something like Artifactory that's locked down, that's cloning, controlling what's happening, what the dependencies are coming off of npm. If we're talking about Node.js development, so they have like a mirror of npm, and like somebody gets control what dependencies get downloaded because they want to control the whole supply chain. Like I've worked at an employer just like this. And it was kind of funny because when we were developing software, we realized like, well, we need another dependency. We have to go and create like a support ticket to get dependencies added into Artifactory. And it was kind of hilarious because the answer is always like, okay, oh, that's the dependency need, no problem. Like we'll add it right away. So it was really creating this false sense of security, right? It was just creating these boundaries to slow down our productivity, because at the end of the day, like nobody ever said, oh no, that dependency is like way too dangerous. That never really happened. And the other thing that I saw is I had coworkers and myself, like we'd come up with this kind of shadow IT, these ways to get around the restrictions of Artifactory. So we're using, reverse proxies or VPNs to, connect to the real NPM because it was, locked down by the firewall. But if you could connect to like a reverse proxy, you could access it. And we're doing all these weird things to try to get around the restrictions, because developers just want to build stuff at the end of the day, right? They just want to be productive. So I find this fear level to be kind of funny also. And I keep skipping over these, but we're moving up the graphic, right? If I go back to level 1, we're way down here and low level at level 1. So now we're at level 2. We're starting to move up that exponential curve, but we're not getting a lot of value yet, right? That's going to happen later. So level 3, going back to bargaining, at this level, we might have a real open supply chain, right? And the devs are free to contribute, but only to like a supplied, only to a control supply chain. So I'm thinking of private forks, things like that to make changes and make fixes to code. There's no contributions to public open source projects. And maybe your organization, I've heard this before, is throwing on buzzwords like inner source. And I'm calling this a buzzword because I feel like it's kind of a cop-out in my opinion. And I'm sure if your full organization can embrace inner source, like that could bring something really interesting to your organization. But in my personal experience, working in a lot of different organizations, that it's generally kind of a cop-out for, why we're not using open source. We're embracing inner source. I feel like this is kind of a buzzword that gets thrown around. So in my own experiences, I've worked from employers like this, and they just, their devs were empowered to use open source, but we couldn't contribute back, right? They always prefer those private forks. And in my consulting work, I've also, had clients that, weren't ready for open source. And they said, okay, but we're going to do inner source. So we're going to embrace open source values, but we're going to keep the code still private to the organization. But at the end of the day, like they didn't have buy-in from all the management, and there was a lot of lack of trust in the devs, and they weren't empowered to contribute back to that inner source project. And at the end of the day, it was still like a siloed team, working on one project, and nobody else in the organization was contributing or working on it. So this bargaining level, everybody's trying to advance a little bit. Like they see the value in open source, but there's like barriers to making that happen. And here again, we're moving up that curve a little bit, getting a little bit higher on the curve. I realized technically, I think according to the schedule, I probably only have about 2 minutes left, but I'm gonna go a little bit over because we started a little bit late. So let's move on to level 4, acceptance. So here, the developers are really empowered to use and contribute to open source projects. But it's kind of in this like ad hoc, there's not really an optimized or organized manner, right? When we're talking about community contributions. And Uh, they can be part of the open source ecosystem, but like I said, it's not organized. It's not an organized initiative. And I've had other employers like this, and I feel like this is where my current employer was for a long time, and we're trying to make the transition to the next level. So in some previous experiences, I've had employers that truly empowered employees to use and contribute back to open source projects. But I was working at a startup, and we still had that just ship it mentality, right? So it was pretty frustrating for me because I didn't have time to always go back and make contributions in the right way, right? Like make sure that my fixes met the contribution guidelines, and I checked all the boxes, and those issues, those PRs when I was creating them that would really get merged one day. It's like, oh, we don't have time for that. Like it's just changing one file, go ahead, feel free to make a PR. But if it takes any more time than that, like we didn't have time to do it. Like I said, I think my current employer, Nearform, they've been at this level for a long time. They've embraced and contributed to open source. Things like Node.js, Fastify, Mercurius. There's lots of interesting projects. They're sponsored by Nearform, but it wasn't always in a really organized manner, right? And client projects and billable hours always had priority. And I feel like we're making this transition now to this level 5, I'll talk about in just a second. So at this level, though, it's not as strategic as possible, and you're not getting the same potential, bringing back the same potential value to the company or the ecosystem. So let's move on a little bit quicker here. We're moving up the curve, right? We're starting to get a lot of return on our investment. We're getting a lot of value in our organization for what we're investing in open source. So level 5, enlightenment, like this is the goal, right? This is where we all want to be. And here, we're using open source as, strategic, and it's driving innovation and efficiency in the organization. So, we're using open source projects because we see that as being something more efficient for our organization. The organization is sponsoring open source projects. So Nearform sponsors Fastify, Pinot, lots of other interesting projects, Orama, previously known as Lyra. So your organization is sponsoring. You don't have to be like the author of a project, but you can sponsor projects, right? And maybe you have an open source program office. I think this is something really important so that everybody in the organization knows where to turn. They need advice on getting involved in open source and licenses and contributor agreements, contributor license agreements, CLAs, sorry. And they have identified, what are the strategic open source projects for that organization. So if you want to go and contribute to open source while you're working for that employer, like here's the projects that are most strategic for us. Like this is where we need to be investing to bring more value back to our organization. And they have an open source policy, right? So they're educating their employees and devs, or not just devs, anybody can contribute to open source, right? On different open source aspects, legal aspects of that, like I said, the CLAs and licenses. They're also allowing time, right, for people to contribute to open source. So this is something I think really important that you really only get at that level 5 is actually having time to go and work on open source projects. And they're also finding a way to measure those contributions and the return on investment that they're getting from there, not only for the organization but also to the community itself. And actively participating in open source foundations and standards groups. There's tons of them, right? I'm here at the OpenJS Collab Summit, part of the Linux Foundation, but there's so many foundations, and these are going to help bring more value back to an organization because it's going to help it be more well-known and be more effective in the community. And there's so many places to get started if you're interested in working on open source. Although in this audience, I think most everybody here knows that because we're here for the OpenJS Foundation. And like I said, I think Nearform had been level 4 for a long time, and we're starting to reach this level 5. Lyra, which is now known as Orama, the search engine, like this is something that was created by an employee working at Michele Riva, to be exact, working at Nearform. And we have full-time employees that contribute to Node.js, which is just like amazing, right? But the open source program office is still in its infancy, something that's starting to get working, and trying to define those strategic open source projects. So open source obviously so much more than just making a repo public. It's about building a real community. So try to speed this up a little bit so I don't go too much over time for I believe it's my colleague Marco who's going to be speaking just after me. Here we've reached that red level in our exponential curve, kind of an important point. So what about your organization, right? Like what level is your organization at now that we've defined these different levels of open source Zen? And if this was a real audience, I would have people raise their hands of where they're at. And in my personal experience, most organizations are at that 3 to 4 level, right? The levels 1 and 2, like I feel like this is kind of the past. Like most organizations have moved beyond that, although I've still seen a few that are still at that 1 or 2 level. But I think the majority of organizations realize the importance of open source. So we're usually around 3 or 4. So how can we make the leap? How can we make that step to level 5? And don't forget that commercial software has maintenance fees, right? So let's take those fees and let's invest that in an open source alternative. And when I mean invest, I'm talking about people and resources, right? That's the kind of investment that we should be making in open source projects and open source alternatives to that commercial software. And if we do that, that's going to differentiate our organization from the competition and allow us to innovate. We can, you can define your competitive advantage. What's the advantage over your competitors? And it's the way that you use open source and the way you get value from open source. So this can be a differentiating factor for your organization and help you innovate even further in your organization. So I want to challenge everybody here, measure your organization and how can we reach the next level. So this is my open source call to action. Assess the current level of your organization. Understand, the current strategic dependencies, and let's level up. Like that's why we're here. Like let's do this. Like let's make that step to the next place and go out and connect to community. A great place is here at the OpenJS Foundation. It's an open community with open Slack and calendars, and the meetings are open to everybody and anyone. It's all public, right? Like that's what happens at OpenJS Foundation. Anybody can join and see how things work behind the scenes. So let's go out and do it and get involved, and let's help reach that open source Zen level. And if we do, we'll be somewhere like this final last cute animal praying or whatever he's doing with his paws crossed. We'll be reaching that open source Zen maximum. So just real quick before I wrap up, like I said, I work at Nearform. We have full-time employees that contribute to Node.js. You probably know a few of them: Rafael Silva, Marco Lipolotto, Paulo, and Sonia, doing amazing things. And we have tons of NPM packages that are downloaded some, incomprehensible number of times. And we're always hiring. So if you want to talk about that, or if you want to talk about bringing open source to your organization, feel free to reach out to me. You can find us on the socials. You can scan this QR code. You can learn more about me. You can learn more about Nearform. Love to talk to anybody about this, about open source. Love talking about these topics, and reach out and we'll chat some more. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for making this happen. And hope to talk to you all soon. See you next time.